In today's lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the Effector process as proposed in information processing models. The Effector process is where the motor program commands are designed and also where they're stored. These motor programs, I want you to consider, are still part of the central processes. The effector process also organizes information in a sequential and a hierarchical fashion. According to these information processing models, the outcome of the effector process is a stored motor program that is hierarchically and sequentially arranged. So what does it mean to be sequential and hierarchical? Here you could see a model of hierarchical and possibly sequential organization. What I mean by that is notice that there is, in this model, a top-down approach. You might have a president of the organization and vice presidents of the organization, and then the staff that work in the organization, the CEO, the associates, and then the secretaries, let's say. Here is the organizational structure of the Academic Affairs Division at San Jose State about 6 months ago. So you can see that the provost's office is divided into two different levels, or three different levels, really. You have the provost, who's the head of academic affairs, and he's also the senior vice president. Underneath the provost, you have the colleges that each has a dean that's in charge. Underneath the deans, you would have the department chairs or the school directors. You can also see that there are things that occur in the office of the provost where there is a deputy provost, the person who does budgets and planning, and then the chief operations manager basically takes care of everything that's going on inside the provost's office. Also, you could see within this model other levels of the office of the provost that includes where graduate and undergraduate programs are housed, where research is housed on campus, and so on and so forth. So that would be the organizational structure of San Jose State and the Office for Academic Affairs. So we're looking here at the motor program, and basically what the motor program is a set of commands that's stored and that guides the movement form and also the pattern of movement. So the motor program notion actually involves memory, or a hierarchical structure that governs motor behavior. What I mean when I say hierarchical is higher order, or the movement is under cortical control. So in these systems, you have both open loop control and closed loop control, as well as the possibility of having hybrid control. So we've talked about this before. In an open loop system, what that means is that the motor program is run off and it's uninterrupted by feedback. Whereas in a closed loop system, or when a system is under closed loop control, what that means is that feedback is used to guide the correctness of the movement. And that's matched with some stored representation. For example, in Adams' theory, you have the memory trace that's compared with the perceptual trace. And if everything's going okay, then I have a match. And it takes up very little resources in my information processing system that, you remember, has a limited capacity. A hybrid system means that it contains both open loop and closed loop control. Just as we have hybrid models, as in the Prius and other cars, what that means is that sometimes in the Prius it operates sometimes on gas and sometimes on electric. In a hybrid system, we operate sometimes using a closed loop system and sometimes using an open loop system. Most likely humans operate in a hybrid system. So a couple of weeks ago, I actually presented this in class. Many years ago, I lived in an area of Brooklyn. Here's Brooklyn here, called Park Slope. And you'll notice that there is a road that runs all the way through Brooklyn, from one side of Brooklyn, the south part, all the way to the north part of Brooklyn, that leads you onto the Manhattan Bridge. Right here in Washington Square Park, or very close to there, 1 block away, was where my office was located at NYU. So I would literally drive down Flatbush Avenue for a couple of miles, go over the Manhattan Bridge, and then jog over to, meaning with my car, to Washington Square Park. And you'll remember that I was talking about having the traffic cop there, and you'll notice that the traffic cop is giving the car, entering the intersection, telling that person or directing that person to stop, even though the light is green and even though everybody in New York is driving a blue Volvo. But regardless, the point here is, can you determine or describe, is this a closed loop or an open loop system, and why? Here you see a proposed or an existing mock-up for sensors on a car. Possibly these are autonomous vehicles, in other words, self-driving cars. Notice all of the various sensors that you have on these cars, and this would be an example of what you might see in a heads-up display. So it's showing you that your headlights are on, that the windshield wipers are on, and so on and so forth. So the question I have is, do autonomous systems operate using closed loop, open loop, or hybrid control? Well, how do you think that autonomous driving vehicles operate? Also, feedback systems can operate in a continuous feedback fashion or a discontinuous feedback fashion. In a continuous feedback system, there's constant monitoring of the system. In a discontinuous feedback system, there's intermittent monitoring of the system. Consider the resources that would be required in a continuous feedback system versus a discontinuous feedback system. If I had to pay attention to all of the feedback that I was receiving constantly, then that would consume a lot of the resources that I have that we know are limited in information processing. I also could have something called a negative feedback response versus a positive feedback response. And here I'm not talking about negative feedback meaning you did poorly or I don't like you, but rather negative feedback means that when you have a perturbation or something that comes in the way of your movement, it changes your movement. The feedback that you get is in the direction opposite of the change. So here's an example. If I were running through the park and I hit the edge of the surface and my ankle turned towards the grass, most likely I would get information feedback quickly enough so that my ankle can turn back towards the road and I don't fall onto the grass. Whereas a positive feedback response would be if, in fact, I do this often, and as my ankle is turning, I decide to go with the error, in other words, falling onto the grass, and that would be considered a positive feedback response. In the martial arts, we're often taught to give with a hit, a kick, a punch. And by doing that, you're absorbing the force rather than pushing against the force. So the organization of the motor program is in two parts, essentially, or the conception about it is that there is an executive program, which is the larger package, and then there are a series of subroutines that make up the executive program. Here you can see the executive program called the overhead clear in badminton. That's when you go to the back of the court and you basically want to hit the bird or the shuttlecock high above the net so that it can't be smashed back at you. And you want to hit that shuttlecock all the way to the back of the opponent's court. Notice that that's your executive program. Underneath the executive program are several parts of what you have to do in order to meet that executor. These are called the subroutines. You'll notice that there's a grip, stance, a backswing, a forward swing, a point of contact, and then there's a follow through. So each one of these pieces is important to actually being able to execute this executive program called the overhead clear. Can you give an example of another system that's organized with a hierarchical arrangement like this with executive programs and subroutines? Another example would be batting. You could see the grip, the stance, the swing, the follow through, but now you could also see that the swing can be further drilled down so that now you're looking at the movement of the torso, the hips, the shoulders, the arms, and then I could just take out the torso and see how I can drill down to the flexion, the extension, the rotation of the torso. So you can see how extensive the motor program actually becomes as we work towards really identifying each piece of the actual executive program, which in this case would be batting. So in the area of motor control where we have this conversation about the motor program is this idea about Fitts' law. And a man named Paul Fitts, who was at the University of Michigan for many years, developed in 1954 something called the Fitts tapping task. You can see an example of the tapping task here. Basically, this is about a foot wide piece of wood with two metal plates on the top. You can see that there's a plate diameter. In other words, how far is the width of these plates? And then also there's a separation between the plates that's called the interplate separation, or the amplitude is basically the same thing, the distance between the plates. Basically, what Fitts found is that the speed of our movement declines as task difficulty increases. And we could define the index of difficulty as increases in amplitude and decreases in width. Here's an example of somebody from 1975 at Purdue University actually performing the Fitts tapping task. You can see this old picture here from 1975. According to Fitts, performers actually keep speed and accuracy in balance because as speed increases, accuracy declines, and as accuracy increases, speed decline, so we have to be concerned about that. So I'm wondering where we actually have to be concerned with the speed accuracy trade-off. You notice that our smartphones, when I click on a certain icon, I actually can make the information on that screen very large, or I can make the information on that screen very small. By making the information larger, basically I'm increasing the width of the targets and therefore making it easier for me to do the task. It reduces the index of difficulty. So what kind of other application task? You can see an example of the tapping task here. Basically, this is about a foot wide piece of wood with two metal plates on the top. You can see that there's a plate diameter. In other words, how far is the width of these plates? And then also there's a separation between the plates. That's called the interplate separation, or the amplitude is basically the same thing, the distance between the plates. Basically what Fitz found is that the speed of our movement declines as task difficulty increases. And we could define the index of difficulty as increases in amplitude and decreases in width. Here's an example of somebody from 1975 at Purdue University actually performing the Fitz tapping task. You can see this old picture here from 1975. According to Fitz, performers actually keep speed and accuracy in balance because as speed increases, accuracy declines, and as accuracy increases, speed declines. So we have to be concerned about that. So I'm wondering where we actually have to be concerned with the speed accuracy trade-off. You notice that our smartphones, when I click on a certain icon, I actually can make the information on that screen very large, or I can make the information on that screen very small. By making the information larger, basically I'm increasing the width of the targets and therefore making it easier for me to do the task. It reduces the index of difficulty. So what kind of other applications do you see for this knowledge about the index of difficulty and the speed accuracy trade-off?